We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. World War II ended 80 years ago. 4 years later, the Communist Party of China took power. China has, since that time, emerged, or maybe re-emerged, as a global power. And the United States interprets China's rise as an existential threat to America's global power. In fact, the United States is right now planning for war with China. Today we're talking about the political, social, and class character of the Chinese Socialist Project. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today we're talking with Professor Ken Hammond. Professor Hammond is a scholar, he's an educator, he teaches in the United States and in the People's Republic of China. He's the author of many books. From Yao to Mao, 5,000 Years of Chinese History is one of his books. Another is The Human Tradition in Pre-Modern China. Another is The Human Tradition in Modern China. More recently, he's written China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future and China and the World. Professor Hammond, welcome back.
Glad to be here.
Well, Ken, we have a lot to talk about. I know you're just back from China. You've been back and forth to China for decades. You've taught in China. You're obviously, as people can see by the books you've written, an expert on Chinese history. You pay close attention to the Chinese political and economic system. And you're also a socialist. So this gives you a particular important perch, I think, from the point of view of perspective and analysis. And you're just back. And I want to talk to you about what you think is new, what you observed, your reflections on China. 4 years ago, I interviewed you, and we said it's becoming clearer every day that the leadership of Xi Jinping as the leader of the Communist Party of China and the leader of the Chinese government represented a distinctive new stage in China's development, meaning the development of the People's Republic of China. Anyway, we want to go back and revisit Xi's leadership. But when you were there in the recent weeks or months, what was the big takeaway?
Well, I think a couple of things. I was there. I was just there in July. I was earlier this month. I was there for a couple of weeks. I've been back here about a week now. And you know, China is, I hadn't been to China for 6 years. The last time I was there was November of 2019, right before COVID. So a lot of water has gone over the dam since then. So it was interesting to be back. I was in Beijing for a week, and then I was in a city called Jinan, which is the capital of Shandong province, for another week. And the march of development, the expansion of the economy, the prosperity that has been building, especially in urban China, where about 60% of the people live now, it's just remarkable. The level of services and the availability of goods, all this kind of stuff. I mean, there's been tremendous economic development, and of course, you see that being certainly more based on a more equitable model than what we have in the West, even though there's certainly a large indication of inequality within China. You have some very, very, very wealthy people, but what you don't have so much are indeed at all, especially in the cities, is people who simply sort of dropped out through the bottom. So you don't see homeless people. You don't see people, that are obviously in dire economic straits the way that we do on the streets of our major cities here. So that was one thing, just to see that the march of development is continuing. But I also had the experience of conversations with a number of people in Beijing, at the Academy for Social Sciences, at different universities, and old friends, people I've known in China for well over 40 years now. And people in various different settings expressed concerns about sort of the state of play in China right now, that all this development, this tremendous building of infrastructure, the expansion of the consumer economy, the growth in all kinds of educational, healthcare, housing, the improvement in all those things. There have been tremendous accomplishments, but there's also a feeling, a concern that, as I say, many people in different settings expressed to me about the need to maintain the socialist project, to continue to push forward, not, in a sense, not to relax, not to let their guard down, I suppose you might say. And I found that very interesting because there were people, some people talked very explicitly about what they called big capital, private capital, and the need for the party and the state to continue and perhaps maybe ramp up even the oversight that they exercise in order to keep the adverse effects of the use of markets to develop the economy, keep those within bounds, keep those from becoming more problematic. And of course, to try to preclude any effort by bourgeois elements in China of trying to insert themselves into and become more influential within the government. And that was something, as I say, that many people expressed. At the same time, I think the other thing that certainly was kind of very upfront for me in this instance, because what I was doing there when I was in Jinan, I was at Shandong University teaching just a 1-week class at their School of Marxism. And I learned at that point that 1,000 universities, more than 1,000 universities across China have established these schools of Marxism. And this, I think, reflects an important aspect of this sort of new period, this new era that we talked about 4 years ago, and I think is even truer now, with the sort of reinvigoration of Marxism, I guess, sort of putting it back right at the front of the stage, right at the front of concern. For a while back in the 90s, in the early 21st century, China had this sort of low-key approach to international affairs and relations and all that. But now, under Xi Jinping, the socialist project is foregrounded again. It's right out there. People are talking about it. People are engaged with it. And this intensification of Marxist study within the party, within society more broadly, I think that's a good sign, So there's, I had feelings or I had concerns being expressed, but then there were also examples of very positive steps being taken, I think, on especially on the ideological level, but to sort of make sure that socialist project remains. That's the direction. That's the primary focus. So that was an encouraging aspect.
Well, I want to ask you about some of the contradictions that exist in the Chinese model. The Chinese call their economic project socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, it's a little bit up for grabs what that means, but this was basically a political or economic model, I should say, that was initiated in the late 70s following the death of Mao Zedong, the historic leader of the Chinese Communist Party. It introduced economic market reforms into the economy. It allowed private businesses to thrive. It also allowed Western corporations to come into China to set up shop, to exploit Chinese labor and resources. The capitalist corporations in the West did this willingly. Nobody put a gun to their head, as one might think if you listen to American propaganda today. They went to China because they thought they could make a lot of money, and they did make a lot of money. And what China got in return was access to technology that is basically monopolized by Western capital, usually in relationship to socialist countries. There's embargoes and sanctions. The Soviet Union could never get any technology, certainly after World War II, from the United States. There were actual laws against selling even a single computer to the Soviet Union. So China let the wolf in the door, so to speak, the capitalists from the West. And the idea was, okay, they're going to get rich, they're going to exploit Chinese labor, but we're going to learn a lot, we're going to get access to the technology, and we're also not going to treat China as a neo-colonial sort of playground for Western corporations. They insisted in joint partnerships with Chinese enterprises so that China ultimately access this technology and use this technology to develop the country. That said, when the capitalists came in from the West, I think there was an assumption in the United States that ultimately China would overthrow communism, would overthrow the Communist Party. After 1991, I think there was a lot of confidence in Western circles that if China just continued on this road of opening up to Western corporations, ultimately China would go the way of the USSR. The government would be toppled. It would be a capitalist counter-revolution. Anyway, I think the American sort of consensus now is that that is not going to happen, that China is strong, that China isn't weakening, that it's not going to be overthrown. But that doesn't mean that there's not the danger of counter-revolution. And people, I mentioned this to you before the show. If you had asked people, Ken, in 1980, is it possible the Soviet Union could be overthrown within a decade or two? Almost no one in the world would have thought that that was possible. And yet it happened. So there's a dynamism to revolution, but also a dynamism to counter-revolution. This has to be on the minds of the leadership of Xi Jinping, given the phenomena that you're discussing here.
Absolutely. I think that's it's very clear that there are significant concerns about that. And China continues, the leadership continues to have to navigate a very complex route because they continue to want and in many ways need access to global markets, not just in terms of the development that they're engaged with things like the Belt and Road Initiative, but access to the core markets in the West, access to the United States, access to the European Union, because there are still technologies and components and things like that it's much better if China can have access to those. We've learned that when, for example, the United States imposes sanctions or imposes embargoes on things like certain kinds of chips, that, what China does is it buckles down and it gets to work, and they've managed to come up with their own technological innovations. But even that process is based upon the accumulated knowledge, the accumulated engagement that they've had over these last 30, 40 years with the global capitalist system. And the dynamics of that within the country, I think, have been very complicated because you have billionaires in China, and you have people who, play a role. Their enterprises play a role in the economy that's quite important, and they need to continue to do that, at least for the time being. But there's also been efforts, again, kind of in the ideological sphere, but certainly with very practical consequences, to encourage what they call patriotic enterprises, patriotic entrepreneurs, patriotic capitalists. And that is simply to say that while certainly billionaires in China are living material lives that are considerably, to say the least, more comfortable than perhaps the ordinary person, that they are expected to plow at least some proportion of the profits that they're making back into social services and other kinds of social utilities. And that's as may be, but it resonates with this idea of the party and the government playing this supervisory role, playing this role of oversight. They need the markets to function, at least for the time being. They need further development. China still, on a per capita basis, is a relatively poor country. Its economy is now certainly as large as, if not larger than, that of the United States. But, they have a little more than 4 times our population. So it's still not where it needs to be in order to reach a level of material prosperity that can allow for the fuller implementation of real socialist distribution. They don't have that at this point, right? And because of that, because there's still the process of accumulating capital, accumulating social wealth through the extraction of value from labor. I mean, we just have to be upfront that that's what goes on. That's a dangerous enterprise. That's a risky venture, and so the markets cannot just be left to their own devices. It can't just be go for it, guys, and we'll check back with you in a few years. This has to be something that is constantly monitored, constantly overseen. And we see that there's a lot of fine tuning that goes on. From time to time, there will be these conferences where the leadership will meet with leading figures in the capitalist sector, and messages get communicated in both directions. But I think that's a very, very real concern. And when people talk about the worries, the concerns about big capital and private capital, that's exactly what they're expressing is that they want the leadership to continue to exercise that kind of oversight. So I think that within China, that's kind of the main mission. I don't want to say the primary contradiction, but that's the main mission right now, is to keep the market contributions functioning without allowing them to get out of control and allowing a new bourgeois class to emerge and try to dominate the state. And I think that thus far they're keeping that pretty well within bounds. But clearly that's something, as you say, that in a decade the situation in the Soviet Union just collapsed. And I don't see that on the horizon for China. China certainly seems to be conscious of that history and conscious of its own particular path in ways that the Soviet leadership kind of wandered away from. But I think that ironically enough, perhaps the old American civil liberties model, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty or price of freedom. They want to keep their economy free of capitalist bourgeois domination and their society. They need to be eternally vigilant, and that's what we see with the current leadership, with Xi Jinping and the other core leaders in the center.
When you're in China, Ken, I don't know. I mean, you speak the language, so you're able to interact with Chinese people. You're not like an American who happens to simply be visiting on vacation. You actually can interact with people. You've been there for a long time. What about perceptions of the United States, if you can tell? The United States, even during the Vietnam War, the Korean War, certainly later, even though the U.S. was endlessly at war against global South countries, American soft power was still very significant. People looked to the United States. It was the richest country in the world. Hollywood and cultural production in the United States, fashion production in the United States. These were things that permeated the societies all over the world. From Europe to Asia to Africa to the Middle East, I mean, to lesser and greater extents. But certainly the United States, when it was opening up to China, allowing China to come into the world economy as opposed to being sanctioned and blockaded, as happens to Cuba or happened earlier to the Soviet Union, there was the idea that American soft power would just basically take over. And the new generation of policymakers, the new generation of people like leading the economy, they'd become enamored with the United States. And I'm sure that happened to some extent, maybe to a large extent. But now the U.S. has adopted this very confrontational position with China. And as I said in the beginning, preparing for war with China. You only hear hostile, hateful, bigoted things about China from the United States media or its politicians. How, if you can tell, is that impacting consciousness in China or among young people in China? Anyway, what's your feeling about that?
Well, we talked about that quite a bit in the week that I was at Shandong University with the students that I was teaching. They were very, very eager to talk with me, to ask me about things in America, about what's going on and what's social life like, and of course they were very interested in socialism in America, the prospects for that, and we talked a lot about the Party for Socialism and Liberation and things like that. But I was eager to learn from them as well, and we talked a lot about their perceptions, their understandings of what American society was like, what American politics were like, and of course, that was informed both by things that they had read or talked about in school. But of course, the role of media is still very, very important. When United States trade negotiators try to make sure that Hollywood studios can release American films in China, that's not just an economic push. That's an ideological push because they want Chinese people to be exposed to the same ideological messages that inundate us here at home. And and these ideas of the wealth and the wonderfulness of American capitalism. And so we talked about that. And I think that I found it to be very interesting because, I first went to China in 1982, right at the very beginning of the development of the opening up, the period of what they call reform and opening to the outside, the beginning of market mechanisms being utilized. And at that point, there was a wave through the 80s, a real wave of enthusiasm for America. People, American films and other things began to flood in. TV shows, I remember for a long time, the American TV show Dynasty was hugely popular in China, and I mean, God, what a terrible portrayal of American society. But and I think that there was tremendous enthusiasm for the United States in those days. And there's always been a very careful distinction made between the American government, which might conduct itself as an imperialist power, certainly does, and the American people, who were seen as, working people, like working people in China. But today, 2 weeks ago, talking with these students, the attitude has shifted, I think, quite profoundly. That there's still a kind of fascination with the United States, and there's still a recognition of the disparity of material wealth between even a country like China and the United States. But there's a kind of, I don't know exactly how to characterize it, kind of almost like scratching your head, like what the heck is America doing? And that's not just in reaction to Donald Trump. Obviously, everybody around the world is scratching their heads about Trump, but there was a recognition that this is bipartisan. This is just the way American political elites operate, and this hostility towards China, they just don't understand it. I mean, they understand it in the sense of acknowledging it, realizing that it's going on, but they don't understand why. Why can't the United States and China, share in some sort of project of saving the planet from the environmental catastrophes and finding new, health care, programs or drugs or whatever it might be. But of course, they also understand that China, the United States is an imperialist power and it's a capitalist society where the bourgeois elite dominates everything. And so there's this very mixed sort of consciousness, much more so than there was, let's say 30, 40 years ago. And I think that there's an apprehension. There's a real sense that the situation is dangerous. And again, there's a sort of incomprehension of that in that, does the United States really think, do American political leaders really think that a war with China would do them any good? I mean, of course it would be terrible. It'd be terrible in China, it'd be terrible for everybody involved. But it would be devastating for the United States as well. And they're just baffled by how, whether it's Obama and the pivot to Asia or Biden and his nonsense or Trump, that the American politicians seem to have no grasp on the realities of what's happening in China. And that, boy, this is China's development is part of this larger global reconfiguration, going on exactly as you mentioned, by breaking that monopoly on modern productive technologies that gave the West its edge, for 150 plus years. That's all gone. That's over. And they don't like that. It flips them out, but they don't seem to be able to see any path forward that doesn't involve hanging on to their power and trying to block anybody who challenges that. And that, of course, you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle, so that's a very, very dangerous situation.
There is the issue of socialist consciousness. Is it strong? Is it weak? Is it uneven, as you pointed out in the beginning of the show. And then there's the issue of national consciousness, meaning how do you view your country and its place in the world? And the United States is a very new society. The Constitution, well, we'll hit the 250-year mark soon, and Donald Trump will celebrate it. Well, China, 250 years ago was like yesterday for China. China goes back, your book, From Yao to Mao, 5,000 years of Chinese history. I mean, it's not really possible, I think, for most Americans to wrap their head around the idea that a nation, a people, a civilization has existed for literally thousands of years. And the other point of this history is that China was, and again, most Americans won't know this, China was not a small power, and it was a major power. And I don't just mean like large in population or large in territory. It was a leader of the world economy, a leader of science, a leader of technology. So the Chinese population today, highly educated, has to be aware that China was the leader of the world. That the idea that America is great and wonderful, and America say we are exceptional. Well, the United States is 250 years old. What would be exceptional if your society was 5,000 years old? I mean, that would be exceptional. Just talk about that, because you're also a scholar in Chinese history. But I want to go back, consciousness. How do Chinese people, especially younger people, perceive this national consciousness, China's place in the world?
Yeah, certainly there's a great degree of pride in China's past, pride in its cultural accomplishments over literally thousands of years. I suppose we would say domestic tourism, people going around and seeing, natural sites, of course, but also historical sites. You think about going to Xi'an and seeing the terracotta warriors, those are 2,200 plus years old, the depth of history and the continuities across time are really quite remarkable in a way that a country like the United States simply doesn't have. But even Western civilization more broadly, this idea of the West as sort of the dominant global power, that's a very, very short-lived phenomenon. Future historians, when they look back, they'll see the period of European and American colonialism and imperialism as just a blip. And what the world is doing now is returning to a more multi-centric system, but one within which China is going to play a very important role in the way that it did, until the Industrial Revolution gave the West the capacity to impose its power and pump out its inexpensive commodities, and that for a while reconfigured the world in a very Eurocentric way. But that's over. That's gone, and now the world is going to look a lot more like it used to. And within that, China's going to play a very, very prominent role. And young people, I think all Chinese, but young people especially, they're very conscious of that. But it's interesting. One of the big initiatives that is going on with China right now, and they just had a big conference, an international conference in June in Beijing with representatives from 140 countries as part of what's called the Global Cultural Initiative or Global Civilization Initiative. And this is one, there's two or three of these major global initiatives. There's a Global Development Initiative and things like that. But the Cultural or the Civilization Initiative is really interesting because it's an effort to recognize and respect the diversity of cultures around the world. That we have all these different countries, we have all these different societies, different peoples, different communities, and they have their various cultural histories and their various traditions and practices and beliefs and all that. And now you were talking right at the beginning about this question of globalization. Yeah. is globalization an economic process that is designed to have global capital penetrate wherever it can to enrich an elite, or is it, can it be something different? And something like the Global Civilization Initiative is looking at a very, very different model, because the theme is kind of, strength through diversity or something like that, unity in diversity, things like that. Because there's a dialectic, and this is true within China, and they recognize that it's going to be true for cultures around the world. A dialectic between these traditions, which after all grow out of societies that were not socialist, that were, had their own systems of hierarchy and exploitation and all that, and yet they were also expressions of the creativity and the dynamism of people, of working people. So we want to respect those cultural traditions, learn from those, draw from those the things that are positive and that can contribute to a better future. But at the same time, the other side of that dialectic is modern industrial production and the totally different scale of things that we deal with in the modern world, and the capabilities through communication, transportation, things like that, of creating a society in which an equitable distribution of socially produced wealth is actually possible. It's actually something that we can do. And eventually we can do it very easily, So this idea that China doesn't want to impose its culture, its way, its path on everybody else. It's so different from the United States, this belief, this attitude that, everybody in the world wants to be an American. I think you and I certainly grew up, in a country where that was a very explicit message, that everybody wanted to be like us. They wanted our things, they wanted to watch our movies, they wanted to wear our clothes and listen to our music and all this. That's not how China works, and that's not China's vision of a future. It's a world in which they celebrate this diversity. They celebrate all the different cultures, while at the same time working to bring people together in ways that will be mutually beneficial, so that those cultures can flourish again in that same way of drawing on what's good from the past to serve the development of the future, without carrying along a lot of the problems that those more historic societies, those older class societies, threw up. We want to build a future, a socialist future, but it's one that has to be built upon respect for the realities and the circumstances of different people in different places with different histories and different cultures. That idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics, it's got to be socialism with X characteristics. Here, we're working for a revolution for socialism with American characteristics, because that's what Marxism tells us. You work from the realities, from the material conditions with which you're confronted. People don't make history in circumstances of their choosing. They got to work with the cards they're dealt. Anyway, that's a long response, but that's basically how I see that aspect.
No, that's super helpful. Thank you. I want to ask you another thing, since you've been back and forth for so long. I mean, China opened up, obviously it went through a process of major dynamic and rapid urbanization. Again, people coming from the countryside, available to become wage workers in many of these private enterprises, many Western corporations. The country was very, very poor. I mean, even it still is poor. Like the big anti-poverty initiative that China is so proud of today, it's lifting and has lifted 850 million Chinese people out of extreme poverty. But by extreme poverty, we're talking about $2.30 a day. Anything under that is extreme poverty. So if those people are out of extreme poverty, that doesn't mean they're not still poor. They are poor, but they're not poor in the same extreme way. So a major social achievement, but a poor country. As China developed so rapidly, urbanization so rapidly, industrialization so rapidly, there was also major economic problems that developed. I mean, I can remember before I think it was the 2004 Olympics that was in China, if my memory serves me correctly. There was so much smog, or maybe it was the 2008 Olympics. I can't remember which. So much smog that people were worried that the games could actually take place. And then China did these sort of initiatives to clean the air, and they succeeded actually in cleaning the air temporarily. Well, what about now? You're back. Now it's 2025. We're hearing a lot about China's prioritization of clean air, clean water, mitigation against climate catastrophe. What are you observing?
Well, I think this is an area where you really see the sort of reality of things, that we're not talking here about abstract concepts. We're not talking about utopian schemes. We're talking about trying to solve very real problems and solve them in ways that are going to work, but that they're not perfect. They're not easy. It's not just flipping a light switch. I mean, I was living in Beijing in 2008, and I was living in an apartment on the 25th floor of an apartment complex, and there were days, early in the year when you couldn't see the ground. The smog was so bad you could not see the ground, and it was phenomenal. They certainly cleaned it up for the games, and that was great. Now, though, they have taken great strides towards addressing environmental issues. And this is one of those dynamics where when they undertook market reforms and they started this process of rapid development, there was an awareness. I don't know that it was a full or perfect awareness, but there was an awareness that was going to bring environmental stresses with it. Certainly, if you look at the history of industrialization in the West, I mean, I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and the steel mills used to pollute the air in ridiculous ways. Those kinds of adverse environmental effects were part of that process of development, and they knew that might happen, or that was going to happen. But when they reached a point at the beginning of this century, certainly in the first decade of this century, reached a point where there was sufficient social accumulation, the accumulation of value that was aggregated by the state, and that could be deployed in ways that would start to address these social contradictions, whether it was inequality or environmental damage or other issues. And so they've invested tremendously in alternative energy, in electric vehicles, solar panels, all this kind of stuff. And now China is at the point, they're right at the tipping point where almost 50% of energy produced and consumed in China now comes from renewables, alternatives, solar power, wind power, water power, some nuclear power. But China has vast reserves of coal. Even at present consumption levels, they got 500 years worth of coal. So it's cheap. That's, if they're going to continue the pace of development, they're still using a lot of coal, and that's a problem, and they know it's a problem, but it is a problem. China still, even for all the wonderful things they've done with renewable energy and all that, it's still a big contributor to greenhouse gases, to carbon in the atmosphere. So that's a situation in which their path forward is one that they have absolutely got to attend to. Again, it's within this whole framework of staying true to the mission, completing the mission, and understanding that a big part of that mission, a big part of the revolution has to be just trying to make sure that the Chinese people can survive and flourish on a planet that isn't going to burn itself up. And so that's a huge challenge. It's one that they've made tremendous progress on, and they certainly remain dedicated to. Every so often now, in recent months, I've been reading articles about this, that, or the other target. They set this target for 2030, but they've already achieved it. They're doing great things, but they face a lot of challenges, and they face a lot of contradictions within their system. I mean, to put it in very basic terms, the Ministry of Coal Production is one of the largest institutions in the world, right? It employs, millions and millions of people. It has tremendous economic assets. And of course, it's like politicians in West Virginia. They want to continue to preserve and promote their own contributions to economic development, shall we say. But that's a problem. And there's been a lot of coverage lately of one of the provinces, Shanxi province in the northwest, which is where most of the coal reserves are and where a lot of the mining has gone on. And now, they're really starting to push back. They're shutting down mines. They're converting to alternative energy, even within Shanxi province. What do you do with those coal miners? What happens to them in the economy, So these are real practical problems, real serious contradictions that they're addressing, and they're devoting socially accumulated wealth to resolving, but they're still very much in process. They're tasks in hand, and obviously we don't know what the ultimate outcome will be. We wish them well, we support them, we extend our political and other forms of support as we can, while recognizing that they have these very challenging contradictions, and that it's a work in progress. It is not a done deal. It's not a completed mission. The revolution goes on. Power has been seized. All this has been accomplished, but the process has to go on and on. We don't know when. Obviously, it never really ends, but we don't know when we're going to cross certain thresholds.
Indeed. As a socialist, as a Marxist, Ken, and you and I have, as socialists and as Marxists, have discussed Chinese foreign policy in the past. We did a 9-hour series that we've compiled now about going decade after decade through China's foreign policy. And it went through many, many different changes. There's not just a Chinese foreign policy. Maybe there are some elements that are consistent, but it's largely reactive to the environment in which China finds itself, and then also amplifying certain initiatives China was taking. So when the China opened up, when the Chinese government, following the death of Chairman Mao, decided to have the opening up reforms and allow Western corporations. So again, a dynamic process, very dynamic. When Marx and Engels were writing the Communist Manifesto, or Socialism, Utopian or Scientific by Engels, or Capital by Marx, this was the beginning stage of what we now call, or what they called and we still call, scientific socialism, trying to use a scientific, historical, materialist methodology, a non-utopian vision of the class struggle for the eventual creation of socialism on the road to a classless society. When Marx and Engels were writing, they expected that socialism would take root first in the countries where capitalism was most developed, in Germany or France or the UK, and that the task of the socialists, the Marxists, the communists, was to make that abundant society, that abundant economy, a rational, humane, and serving society rather than a clique of capitalists who are only trying to enrich themselves. As it turns out, history plays lots of tricks, and historical prognoses are frequently amended, maybe always. The revolution didn't happen in Germany, it didn't happen in France or the UK or the United States. It happened, in the words of Lenin, not where capitalism was strongest, but where imperialism was weakest. He said the link in the chain of imperialism broke where it was weakest, meaning at the Russian Empire. Part imperialist, part colony, that sector of world capitalism that was the weakest. Then the revolutions happened in Vietnam, in Korea, China, Cuba, basically global South, colonized countries, also where the chain of imperialist domination was weaker and thus able to break. And so the revolution was in a way easier to make in those countries, but the building of socialism is harder because the material basis for socialism isn't poverty, and it's not the lack of productive forces. It's just what Marx and Engels had said it was, which was an abundant economy. So then under the leadership of Lenin and other Soviet leaders, socialist methods were applied to basically carry out economic development models in underdeveloped countries development models that had to go very quickly because they were also threatened with imperialist intervention, wars, counter-revolutions. So there are all kinds of distortions that have happened. And yet at the same time, the essence of the socialist project, until the government was overthrown in the case of the Soviet Union, that was preserved. How, just very shortly, and this is my final question for you, when Xi Jinping says we're still a developing country, but our aspiration is full socialism, our aspiration really is communism, what does he mean by that? And what's the time frame that the Chinese leadership, the current leadership, the Xi Jinping leadership, what are they talking about? What are they envisioning?
Well, they characterize the circumstances, the situation now, as being in the primary stage of socialism. They have established some mechanisms for, redistribution of socially accumulated wealth. But we're still at a very initial, phase of that, stage of that. There's, I think if to the extent that they put a timeline on it, there's talk about achieving socialism in the sense of a socialist, program of distribution by the middle part of this century, maybe by 2060. I hear that number, Barrett, put about from time to time. But even that, it will be an initial stage of socialism. The process of reaching a level, and of course now with the environmental stuff, this gets even more complicated. A level of material abundance, material prosperity in which everybody can have, the things that they need, to live a comfortable, fulfilling life. To achieve that, it's still, there's a long way to go. Obviously, the goal isn't to have everybody in China live the kind of materialist lifestyle that Americans live. We would eat everything on the planet in a few weeks. But to find a sustainable, viable kind of, as a term that Xi Jinping uses a lot these days, of a sort of environmental socialism, eco-socialism, as we often call it here, that meets people's needs, their real needs, their substantive needs, cares for the people, puts the interests of the people first, without just wallowing in consumerism, But to get there, it's a complex path. So they're looking at mid to latter part of this century to achieve a basic level of socialist distribution. Beyond that, I don't think there's a real concrete timeline. They're working right now on the new 5-year plan. And that's going to be a very interesting development, I think. We should be hearing about that more later in this year and the beginning of next year. But it's a long and winding road, to say the least. And of course, this is a problem that many people, good, sincere socialists in the West, express frustration with. That why hasn't China achieved socialism yet? They have state power. Why don't they just create socialism? But it's it has proven to be, as reality has asserted itself, a very, very complex and slow process. That and of course, as we talked about earlier today, there are bourgeois elements in China that still threaten possibly to put up some problems with that. So it's an ongoing process. They do have, specific objectives for around the year 2060, but the way the details of how that's going to work, I think, remain very much. Those are also works in progress. These ideas, at least they're still doing 5-year plans, and I know that they have longer term perspectives, but I haven't seen that spelled out in a way that's super concrete. It's a commitment to a vision, but I think it's one that again is going to have to evolve dialectically as progress is made.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to encourage people to get hold of Ken's latest books, China's Revolution and the Quest for a Socialist Future, and China and the World, which looks at China's foreign policy since 1949. You can get both of those by going to 1804books.com. Ken Hammond, thank you so much.
Always great to talk, Brian. Glad to be here.